Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. The passenger, the road out, the rain came in slow at first, fat droplets tapping against the windshield as Ethan pulled onto the empty stretch of highway. He had been driving for nearly 4 hours already, the weight of exhaustion pressing at the edges of his mind, but stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. The highway was empty. Nothing but darkness swallowing the road ahead, the trees on either side rising like jagged walls. No streetlights. No houses. Just the occasional reflective mile marker gliding past, disappearing into the void behind him. He had left Chicago that morning. Or was it yesterday? Time had blurred. The days leading up to his departure had been filled with frantic packing, rushed phone calls, and the gnawing anxiety that this wasn't the right decision. But what choice did he have? The job in Denver was supposed to be a fresh start. A friend of a friend had pulled some strings, got him an interview at a private security firm. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and more importantly, it was away. Away from the apartment filled with memories. Away from the city that had started to feel like a prison. Most of all, it was away from her. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his jaw clenching involuntarily. He didn't want to think about her. Not now. Not after everything. But the image of Olivia's face wouldn't leave him. The way she had looked at him in those last weeks, her eyes distant, unreadable. The apartment had grown cold, the silence between them stretching until it was unbearable. When she left, she hadn't even said goodbye, just a note on the kitchen counter. Take care of yourself. And now, here he was, driving alone on an empty highway, running from something he couldn't quite name. The rain hadn't let up in hours. It hammered against the windshield in heavy sheets, the wipers struggling to keep up. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The highway stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by darkness. He hadn't meant to drive this late. He should have found a motel hours ago, but something had pulled him forward, a nagging, restless feeling in his gut. Now the gas was running low, and there wasn't a sign of civilization in sight. The road felt different tonight. The air inside the car was stale, thick, as if he weren't alone. He flicked on the radio to drown out the silence. Static, just static. Then, from the corner of his eye, movement. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. A figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible through the rain. A lone hitchhiker. No bag, no umbrella, just standing there, watching. As he passed, Ethan's stomach twisted. The figure's face, he hadn't seen it. No reflection in the headlights. And yet there they were. His foot pressed harder on the gas. The car sped forward, rain blurring the world outside. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at the trees lining the road, at the shadows that seemed to move just beyond the headlights. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. No, that wasn't possible. He had just passed them. There were no side roads, no shortcuts, no way someone could have gotten ahead of him so quickly. His fingers were ice cold against the wheel. He sped up. The road stretched forward empty. He told himself it was fine, just a mistake. A weird coincidence. Minutes passed. His breathing slowed. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe a whisper, low from the back seat. He was alone. He had been alone. Slowly, against every screaming instinct in his body, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was sitting in the back seat. No face, just a shape, a shadow where a person should be. The whisper came again, closer this time, wet, crawling into his ears like fingers pressing into his skull. Soft at first. Keep driving. He was alone, wasn't he? His breath caught in his throat, his skin prickled with cold sweat. The car swerved slightly as he forced himself to keep his hands steady. It's just exhaustion. It's just your mind playing tricks. Ethan's entire body went rigid. He couldn't move. His body felt distant, numb, like he was watching himself from outside his own skin. Then, cold breath on his neck, his mind shattered. With a strangled yell, he yanked the wheel. The tires screeched. The car spun violently. The world tilted. Glass shattered, metal screamed, then silence. When Ethan came to, the car was still. The windshield was cracked, the hood crumpled against a tree. Rain dripped through a hole in the roof. He was bleeding, dazed, and he was alone. The back seat was empty. Shaking, he fumbled for the door handle, his fingers slick with sweat. He needed to get out, get away. But then, in the broken rearview mirror, a reflection, not his own. It was still there. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Blood trickled down his temple, warm against his chilled skin. The car was ruined, steam curled from beneath the crumpled hood. The cracked windshield distorted the trees beyond, their gnarled limbs stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. His entire body ached, but the fear overpowered the pain. The whisper still echoed in his head. Keep driving. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. His fingers fumbled against the seatbelt latch, jammed. He yanked it again, his heart hammering until finally, with a sharp click, it released. He shoved the door open, stumbling out into the cold night. The road was empty. The forest around him was dense, wet, watching. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul, like rotting leaves and stagnant water. Ethan's hands trembled as he dug his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked. No service. Of course. He looked up and down the road. Nothing. No headlights in the distance, no signs of life. He could have been the last person on Earth. Then movement, not in the trees, not ahead of him. Behind, his body went cold. He turned slowly, dread curling in his stomach. The car's broken side mirror reflected the road. A road that should have been empty. But there, standing just beyond the wreckage, was the figure, still, watching, waiting. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse roaring in his ears. His boots slipped on the wet pavement, sending him sprawling onto the road. Pain exploded in his elbow, but he barely noticed. His gaze was locked on the thing standing where no one should be. Then it took a step forward. Ethan scrambled to his feet. He didn't think, just ran. The forest was thick, the trees pressing in around him, the underbrush clawing at his legs. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had no idea where he was going, but he couldn't stop. Not when it was behind him. The road had been endless. The trees had been watching. But the whisper had told him one thing: keep driving. And now he had stopped. That was a mistake. His foot snagged on a root and he hit the ground hard, mud splattering across his chest. A sharp pain lanced up his knee. He rolled onto his back, gasping, his vision spinning. Silence. No footsteps. No whisper. Had he lost it? He lay there for a moment, staring up at the trees. The sky beyond was black, starless. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then a voice. Not a whisper, not a sound inside his head. A real, human voice, distant. Hey, you all right? Ethan sat up fast, his body screaming in protest. His head snapped toward the sound. A flickering neon glow cut through the trees, barely visible past the tangled branches. A gas station. For a moment he thought it might be a hallucination, a cruel trick of exhaustion and fear. But then he saw it again. Warm light spilling out from a dirty storefront window, an old blue pickup truck parked outside. He forced himself to his feet, limping towards salvation. The Glenwood Gas and Mart was the kind of place that looked untouched by time, an aging relic of a forgotten highway. The cracked asphalt was lined with a single rusted gas pump, the store itself a squat concrete structure with a weathered open 24 hours sign buzzing weakly against the night. The man who had spoken stood near the door, arms crossed. He was older, with graying stubble and a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. He squinted as Ethan approached. Jesus, kid, you look like hell. Ethan swallowed. His throat was raw, his lungs burning. Aye, my car I crashed. The man nodded like he already knew. Saw the wreck in my mirror a few miles back. Figured you'd be on foot. Ethan blinked. Wait. You, but then the man stepped forward, clapping a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. His grip was strong, too strong, and he leaned in. Tell me, the man said, voice low, serious. You see anything on that road? Ethan stiffened. A cold, creeping dread curled in his stomach. He should lie. He should say no. But his mouth was dry, his body still trembling from the thing he had seen, the whisper that had touched his mind. The man must have seen it in his face because his grip tightened. You stopped, he muttered. Not a question, a fact. Ethan tried to step back, but the man held firm. Listen to me, kid. Whatever you do, his voice dropped to a whisper. Don't look back. The gas station door opened, a bell jingling above it. A woman's voice cut through the moment. Frank, leave the poor guy alone. The man, Frank, let go of Ethan, stepping away like nothing had happened. Get yourself inside, he said, exhaling smoke. Dry off. But don't talk about it, and don't, his eyes darkened. Acknowledge it. Ethan's hands were still shaking as he stepped inside. The station smelled like burnt coffee and dust. The woman behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with frizzy blonde hair, gave him a once-over. Rough night, Ethan swallowed. His throat was dry. You could say that. She nodded toward a pot of coffee. Help yourself. He didn't need to be told twice. He poured himself a cup with unsteady hands, taking a long sip. The warmth barely cut through the cold in his bones. Frank came in behind him, dropping into a creaky chair near the counter. He didn't speak, just watched. For a while, Ethan said nothing. Just let the warmth of the station settle over him, tried to convince himself that this place was real, that he was safe. But then, the bell above the door jingled. The air changed. The temperature dropped. Frank sat up straight, his expression hardening. The woman behind the counter stiffened. Ethan turned. A man had entered. No, not a man. A shape, tall, thin, drenched from the rain, face hidden beneath a shadowed hood, the same impossible figure from the road. It had followed him. The whisper curled through his mind, a slow, creeping tendril of ice. Keep driving. Ethan's breath hitched. The woman behind the counter moved first. We're closed, she said, voice tense. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. Frank rose from his seat. His face was pale. You should leave, he said, voice firm. Ethan felt his stomach drop. The figure turned its head toward him. And though its hood still covered its face, Ethan knew it saw him. Frank's voice came again, this time sharper. Urgent. Don't look at it, kid. But Ethan already had. Ethan couldn't move. The air inside the station had thickened, pressing against his chest, suffocating. The figure stood just inside the door, rainwater dripping from its clothes onto the checkered linoleum. The hood obscured its features, but Ethan knew it was smiling. Frank moved first. He stepped in front of Ethan, slow but deliberate, his body tense. You need to go, he said, his voice edged with something Ethan couldn't place. The figure didn't react, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The woman behind the counter, her name Tag Reed Judy, was already reaching beneath the register. Ethan saw the glint of metal as she wrapped her fingers around something. A gun, a knife, he wasn't sure. But none of it felt like it would matter. The thing in the doorway wasn't human. It never had been. Frank tried again, his voice firmer. We don't serve your kind here. That made Ethan's stomach drop. Your kind, the thing shifted slightly, just enough to send a shiver crawling down Ethan's spine. Then it spoke, not with words, not really. The sound came from everywhere at once, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling around the shelves, seeping into Ethan's bones. You looked. The lights flickered. Judy moved fast, yanking a sawed-off shotgun from beneath the counter. Out, she snapped, leveling the barrel. Now. Ethan expected a reaction, a flinch, a movement, anything, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, Ethan saw it. Beneath the hood, not a face, not a skull, just an absence, a void where features should be, an empty space that shouldn't exist. Something inside him cracked. His mind screamed. And then the bulbs burst. Glass rained down. The station plunged into darkness. The gun went off. Boom. The muzzle flashed, blinding in the sudden blackness. The noise rattled the walls, the shelves, Ethan's skull. But when the flash died, the figure was gone. Silence. Only the sound of rain outside. Judy cursed under her breath, breathing hard. Frank exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping. Ethan felt his own breath return in shallow, ragged bursts. What the hell was that? He whispered. Neither of them answered. They didn't open the door again until dawn. The station stayed locked, the three of them sitting in silence under the dim emergency lights. Ethan barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw it, that smile, that nothingness where a face should be. When the sun finally dragged itself over the horizon, Frank got up, cracked his knuckles, and muttered, I'll check outside. Judy handed him the shotgun. Be careful. Ethan watched as Frank stepped out onto the lot. The mist had settled thick over the highway, clinging to the trees like cobwebs. The road was slick, empty. The sky was dull gray, the kind of color that promised rain would come again soon. Frank scanned the lot, checked behind the truck. Then he knelt down. Ethan stood, heart pounding. "What is it?" Frank didn't answer right away, just ran a hand over his mouth, exhaling sharply. Then, without looking up, he said, "Kid, you better come see this." Ethan hesitated. His legs didn't want to move, but something in Frank's voice made him push forward. He stepped outside, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the stale warmth of the station. The ground was damp beneath his boots. He moved toward Frank, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then he saw it. The footprints, not Frank's, not his own, something else. A trail of wet footprints leading away from the station. But they weren't human. They were long, too long. The shape of them was wrong, the spacing unnatural, like whoever left them had taken huge, loping steps. And the worst part, they didn't fade. The rain should have washed them away. The wind should have disturbed them, but they were perfectly intact, like they had been left just seconds ago. Judy swore under her breath. Frank stood slowly, gripping the shotgun tight. "You need to leave, kid." Ethan blinked. "What?" Frank turned, fixing him with a stare that sent ice through his veins. "You stopped," he said, voice low. "You looked." Ethan swallowed hard. Frank nodded toward the footprints. "And now it's following you." Judy crossed her arms. "You can't stay here. It'll come back." And next time, she shook her head. "Next time, it won't just be standing there." Ethan felt his stomach twist. "So what am I supposed to do?" Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "You keep moving." Judy nodded. "You keep driving. No stops, no turns, no looking back." Ethan stared at them. They weren't joking. This was normal for them. This thing, the road, whatever was out there, they knew it. And if they were telling the truth, if stopping was what had drawn it to him, he had made a mistake. A big one. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A key. "About 5 miles up, you'll see an old motel on the left," he said. "Run by a guy named Mercer. He's like us. He'll know what to do." Ethan hesitated before taking the key. And then Frank met his gaze. His expression was grim. "You keep driving." Ethan's fingers curled around the key. His hands were still shaking. He left the station 20 minutes later. Judy handed him a thermos of coffee and the keys to an old beater of a car that had been parked for what looked like a century, tires half bald and growing moss on one side through the faded, worn, soft yellow paint. Frank gave him a loaded revolver. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them said goodbye. He pulled onto the road, the mist curling around the asphalt. The footprints were still there, leading into the trees. The forest felt closer than before. Hungrier. As Ethan drove, he kept his eyes locked forward. He didn't check his mirrors, didn't look at the trees, didn't listen to the whisper curling at the edge of his mind. Keep driving. So he did. But 5 miles up the road, the motel wasn't there. The road stretched ahead, empty, silent. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened as he glanced at the odometer. He had driven 5 miles, maybe more. There should have been a motel by now, but there was nothing. Just trees, thick and unyielding. The mist slithered between them, clinging to the road like it didn't want to let him pass. He swallowed hard. Did I miss it? No, he had been watching, looking for signs. Hell, he had barely blinked. But the motel wasn't there. His chest tightened. Frank had said to keep driving. But how far? Ethan's stomach churned. His body ached from exhaustion, every nerve raw and on edge. His head pounded, his skin felt stretched too tight over his bones. The memory of last night sat like a weight on his chest. That thing. The footprints. The way Judy and Frank had spoken like this was just another Tuesday night. His fingers curled tighter around the wheel. You keep driving. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through him, and then up ahead, something new. A sign. His foot eased off the gas as he squinted through the mist. A battered green road sign stood crookedly at the edge of the asphalt, rust chewing at its edges. The words were barely legible beneath the grime. Welcome to Mercer's Rest. His pulse hammered. That wasn't right. Frank hadn't mentioned a town, just a motel. Ethan slowed, scanning for anything, lights, buildings, a gas station. But the fog was thick, suffocating. The trees pressed close to the road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Still, he couldn't just drive forever. Could he? The thought sent a chill through him. A mile later, the trees finally broke. The road dipped, revealing something through the mist. Ethan's mouth went dry. A town, but it looked wrong. The buildings were old, too old. Weather-worn wooden structures lined the street, their windows dark. The whole place looked abandoned, forgotten. No cars, no lights, just rows of empty, hollow buildings staring back at him like a graveyard of a place that shouldn't exist. His stomach twisted. The road led straight into town. He should turn around. His gut screamed for him to turn around, but something else whispered in his mind. You're already here. His hands trembled on the wheel. The town stretched ahead, silent, waiting. Ethan exhaled shakily. Then, against every ounce of logic left in his body, he didn't keep driving. The town felt like a place frozen in time. Ethan eased the car to a stop in front of a cracked old diner, its neon sign long dead. The air was thick with stillness, like the whole place had been abandoned overnight and left to rot. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots. The smell of damp wood and something metallic lingered in the air. No birds, no wind, just the faint hum of his own breath. Ethan turned, scanning the buildings, storefronts with faded signs, a barber shop with a shattered window, a post office with rusted-out mailboxes. No people, no sounds. And yet somewhere nearby, a radio crackled to life. He spun, heart slamming against his ribs. The sound drifted from a small general store across the street, its door slightly ajar. A voice hummed through the static low. Garbled. Ethan's hands balled into fists. He should leave, get back in the car and go, but something inside him had already decided. He stepped forward. The air inside the store was stale, thick with dust. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old canned goods and faded newspapers. The radio sat on the counter, its dial turning slowly on its own. The voice murmured beneath the static. He's here. Ethan's blood ran cold. A floorboard creaked. His breath caught. Slowly he turned. There, at the back of the store, stood a man. Or something that looked like a man. Tall, thin, dressed in an old flannel, the fabric torn at the edges. But the face, the smile. Ethan stumbled back, heart hammering. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Then you should have kept driving. The lights flickered. Ethan's breath hitched. His body moved before his mind could catch up, feet scraping against the dusty floor as he staggered back. The figure at the end of the store didn't move, but its presence pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. The words it had spoken weren't just heard. They vibrated inside him, threading through his bones like something alive. His back hit a shelf, cans rattling to the floor. The air in the store thickened, growing humid, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the dim bulbs overhead buzzing louder, flickering faster, like the whole place was breathing, twitching, waiting. Ethan bolted. He didn't look back. His feet pounded against the floorboards, lungs burning as he burst through the store's door and into the fog-drenched street. The sky above had shifted, darker now, too dark for late afternoon, the clouds swollen and unnatural. His car sat where he left it, an impossible lifeline in the drowning silence of this place. Heart slamming against his ribs, he yanked the door handle and threw himself inside. The engine roared to life with a guttural growl, tires skidding against the gravel as he reversed so fast the bumper nearly clipped a rusted-out fire hydrant. He didn't care, didn't breathe, didn't think. He drove. The town blurred past, buildings melting into shadows as he tore down the road, the speedometer needle climbing. The sign, "Welcome to Mercer's Rest," flashed by in his peripheral vision, swallowed by fog. He didn't slow, wouldn't slow. Not until he saw another sign, another road, something that would prove he was back in the real world. But the road stretched on, endless. The mist thickened, swirling in slow, deliberate movements, as though it wasn't just fog, but something watching. The trees on either side of the highway loomed closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for him. Ethan's fingers clenched the wheel, knuckles bloodless as he pushed the car faster. The road should have led him somewhere. Another highway, a town, a sign of life. But it remained a hollow stretch of asphalt swallowed by mist. Every mile marker he passed was blank, stripped of numbers, of meaning, as though time itself had unraveled. His breathing was shallow, heartbeat a hammering pulse against his ribs. He risked a glance at the rearview mirror, nothing but dense fog swirling behind him. No town, no figure, no thing, yet the feeling never left. That weight pressing against his skin, wrapping around his thoughts like cold fingers dragging him backward. Something was still watching. A movement, a flicker in the fog to his right. Not a deer, not the sway of branches in the wind, a shape keeping pace with his car. Ethan's stomach twisted. He pressed the gas pedal harder, forcing the engine to snarl in protest. But the shape didn't disappear. It moved effortlessly beside him, shifting within the mist like it belonged to it, like it was part of the road itself. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The mist thinned. The road opened up, and there, finally, a sign. A real one. Exit 41 Blackwood, 2 miles. Ethan exhaled, shaky and uneven. His hands trembled on the wheel as his body slumped forward, exhaustion hitting like a tidal wave. He had to stop, had to rest. Blackwood. He didn't care if it was a gas station, a diner, or a barely standing motel. It was somewhere. But as the fog continued to lift, revealing the stretch of road ahead, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling curling in his gut, an instinctual, primal dread. He had left Mercer's rest behind, but whatever was out there, it hadn't left him, to be continued. If you like the story, tune in for part 2 to see if Ethan finds the truth behind Frank's key. You made it back for now, but the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.